Welcome to the Jersey Justice Podcast, featuring your hosts, attorneys Gerald Clark and Mark Morris.
All right, so Tim, thank you for coming here today on this rainy Friday in Jersey and taking your time to meet here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you're Tim Dillingham, and you are, is it the executive director of the Littoral Society?
Yeah, I'm the executive director of the American Littoral Society. It's its formal name. And unless you were raised by Jacques Cousteau, you may not know what the word littoral means, but it's of or along the coastline. So my group does conservation work broadly, but we work along the edge of the coastline in the bays, mainly because that's where all the life is, one, and that's where all the conflicts are, right, between people and animals and fish and that type of thing.
Yeah, we, the last time we addressed a topic like this, I think we did it in late August or September of 2024, and we had Andrew Chombarry on. And it was a great episode and everything, but it was a little late in the summer. So I'm really happy to have you on because although it's a dreary Friday in Jersey and it's like 40 degrees in April here, it's coming around, and that spring and the pollen's going to be here, and then people are going to actually care about what's going on at the beach and beach badges and why can't I bring my cooler on the beach, and we're going to have boaters complaining that there's too many boats, and then kayakers complaining that they can't access the rivers anymore, and why is this person building in Deal, blocking the public access, and what's going on with these windmills and the whales, and how's the clam population looking?
The red jellyfish, the fish eggs with yourselves,
What new invasive critter has shown up? Yeah.
So Mark and I are psyched that you're here because you seem to be like at the epicenter of all those issues in New Jersey that people really are caring about even more now as the season rolls around and MDW rolls around. You know what MDW is?
No.
Memorial Day weekend.
Oh,
come on. Now,
MDW. Okay. Yeah, well, that's cool. I mean, I am in the center of a lot of those things, and the organization, that's what its mission revolves around. All those complex things, the things we love about the ocean, it being clean, it being full of fish, it being a place we can recreate, and we have a long history. The organization founded in 1961, so they've been there for a long time, fighting for really important issues, right? I think the first big issue was about there's a cruiser, old Spanish-American War cruiser called the San Diego, which is sunk off of the tip of Breezy Point. Somebody wanted to raise it up and salvage it, and of course it was a great dive site, right? So the Littoral Society joined with a bunch of divers to preserve it, make sure it was there, so it wasn't just taken up, torn apart, and sold. We led the fight against ocean dumping, the dumping of used to be like acids and toxics from the manufacturing facilities up in the harbor mainly. But
What harbor?
New York Harbor.
New York Harbor,
Yeah,
got it.
or Newark Harbor.
Yeah.
The Arthur Kill, places you see all the factories, right, that people like to try to sort of pigeonhole New Jersey to be like. But, all that stuff used to just go on barges out into the ocean, and they would dump it, including hundreds of millions of gallons of sewage sludge from the city of New York. And there was a time that they used to burn excess wood. You had scrap wood from construction projects. They loaded it on a barge, took it about 3 miles out, and burned it, and then just dumped it over the side. So the Littoral Society started. They formed what was called the Ocean Dumping Task Force. Got a bunch of people together. Just regular people that cared.
I remember growing up on the Jersey Shore, mostly in Spring Lake, and we used to belly board, they would call it. They had these foam boards, and they would break, and we loved it. But the worst was when the lifeguards, and they'd come down and be like, oh, you can't go in the water today. And be like, why? And be like, oh, it's a red tide.
yeah.
Like, what
Red
the hell is a
algae.
red tide?
Yeah, exactly. exactly.
And there was the needles would wash up.
Right,
but
the
yeah.
needles, and then, the late 80s, kind of like the ugliest of ugly was when the dolphins started dying. And yeah, I mean, that's all just the various creative ways we've mistreated the ocean, right? And which is usually done by a small group of people, relatively, compared to the rest of us who love the Jersey Shore and want it clean and, full life, which it can be and should be. So my organization has been, we use advocacy and education and lots of lawsuits. We've been involved in lawsuits of everything from the dumping of contaminated dredge material from New York Harbor in the ocean to public access, all the way up to the Supreme Court on public access cases. So my life is very much intertwined with all those issues.
What got you down that path? Like, or what made you kind of, I guess, gravitate towards the ocean? And
Well,
Days.
so I grew up in a Navy family, right? So we always lived on the ocean, whether that was the Pacific Ocean in California or the Atlantic in Virginia Beach, or the other side of the Atlantic in Spain, or the North Japanese Sea in Japan. We were always right on the ocean, and it just, I'm of age that we grew up with Jacques Cousteau's Undersea World on Sunday nights, religiously watching that, and I've always been fascinated by all of that, and I've been very lucky. My father, despite being a naval officer, loves nature, and always encouraged us to go out, to be out there, took us places, So I just have always been fascinated by it, and then.
What kind of naval officer was he? Was he on a ship or something? Or
He was actually he started off as a Russian specialist and a cryptologist. He's got a great story. He graduated from Harvard in 1953, and they were going to draft him to be a Marine in Korea. And he said, I love the Marines and respect what they do, but I'm not going to go that path. So he enlisted in what they called Officers Candidate School.
OCS, right?
OCS, yep. And so they trained him to be an officer, found out he was a very smart guy, and put him on a path to being a specialist in Russian intelligence, Russian communications.
Can he speak Russian?
Yes,
wow,
fluently. Russian, Greek, Spanish. He speaks Spanish, but
You said you were born in Cyprus.
right.
Yeah.
So we were over there. Yeah, I mean, following him along, and so he was he ended up being a cryptologist. So his job was to listen to the Russian signal traffic, right, and then break it down, decode it, and extract the intelligence from
Wow.
that for the Navy.
They make movies about that.
Yeah. Well, he was in the backstory of a couple of those.
Wow.
And very quiet guy for the most part, but really had a really interesting life, very talented, but loved the ocean. And so, when he had time off, we were always to the ocean. And you were talking about the boogie boards, right? We would go to the Naval Air Station, Oceana, in Virginia Beach, and in the day it was blow up mattresses. Remember the blow up mattresses?
It's a little bit funny, and I have to say it's a bit hypocritical about you and your dad is you spent some time in California, right?
Yes, yeah.
And did you ever surf much, like actual
No,
surfing?
I was a tiny kid.
All right, but you know how surfing's popular, and it's gotten even more popular in recent times.
Yep.
And you know how surf breaks are becoming very competitive and crowded. So I think the little hypocrisy is some of the best surf breaks are in front of naval stations that border coastlines that
Yep.
no one's allowed to.
No one's allowed to be
That's
there.
funny.
Unless you're in the military.
Well, you
But-
could all be Russian spies. That was the way.
No, I'm kidding. But yeah, there's some of the best, like in San Onofre, California.
Yep.
What is that, Pendleton?
Pendleton. Yep.
Yeah, there's some of the best.
Marine base. Yeah.
Yeah, or in front of Pendleton.
Yep.
There, and there's other places in Puerto Rico in front of some of the camp
Right.
bases.
Crash boat. And,
Yeah,
a couple of
but
those.
there's some
breaks.
places that are protected that you can't get to unless you're part of the military. So that's
Yes. Yep. Well, you never really got access to them that I knew of, at least. I mean, they were off limits. They were off limits, right? And but now they're opening up. So, like a couple times I've been to Puerto Rico, there's a break called Crash Boat, where the boats that used to go out and pick up the servicemen when the planes crashed into the Caribbean were docked. It was an old military base, and they've turned that loose. Now it's a public park.
That's why they call it Crash Boat.
Yeah, it's called Crash Boat. It's what they call
because
the
of that.
Because of that, yeah. So, so he had a great life and still having. He's 94 now.
Wow,
so he's
great.
Still cooking along. But I got to go along, and he was a fairly loose guy in terms of discipline. So he would just turn us loose. I have a brother who's about a couple years.
That doesn't sound like a Navy
No,
guy.
it sure doesn't.
Yeah.
No, that's why I mean, he loved the Navy, but I don't think he was ever like sort of a military guy at heart, right? He grew up in a liberal New England family outside of Boston during World War II, and his father my grandfather was in the Army during the wars. So he grew up exploring and then passed that on to me and my brother. So got to see a lot of great stuff, but that kind of brought me to my love of the oceans and coastlines and the life, both the wildlife, the natural life that's in it, and the way people live along the coastline, right? So, which still fascinates me. There's a little bit of an anthropologist in me.
You're going to talk about the Lenni Lenape, aren't you?
No. No. Other than it's fascinating. I always find it fascinating to
like the Lenni Lenape would come down to Manasquan.
Right.
They didn't always, in the warm months and follow the fish and then go back to the mountains and things like that. I believe anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And they were very in tune with nature.
We had one guy on here. I got to say, his name's Jim Keaty, and
I know where you're going with that.
We had him on here, and he's like very liberal in a lot of ways, and he talks about. I mean, he was talking about all different things, but he's like, and the Lenni Lenape, and they should be entitled to this land because we took it from him. And I said, Jim, okay, so if we find out that the Lenni Lenape used to own the bar that you own, will you give the bar back to their ancestors? And
he was like, absolutely.
Yeah, he's
was
like,
he really?
Yeah,
yeah. He's like, well, I would consider that. Sorry, I digress.
That's good.
Go,
Yeah.
keep going.
No,
You're talking about.
And that's a whole other set of questions, right?
But the anthropology you're on.
Well, just so my father has a farm now on the eastern shore of Maryland, on the bay, and just a couple weeks ago I was down there. Has a little stretch of beach. I found an arrowhead.
Wow.
From the Lenni Lenape, and it's probably 6,000 to 7,000 years old. I mean, so there was just this idea of people living along the coast, right? Your point is that they were smart enough to come down and fish and oyster and shellfish, and then when hurricane season started, they moved back up away from the coast, right? But I got interested in the biology of it, and then I wanted to work on this. Was in the early '80s when they were talking about all the problems that Chesapeake Bay was having and was starting to really get a lot of attention, and I wanted to help save the bay. A couple people said, well, if you want to do that, you really got to get a master's degree at the very least, right? So I moved to Rhode Island and took my master's degree up there and fell in love with that coast. What a great place that is.
I was saying I had a big internal conflict about whether or not to go to University of Rhode Island, essentially for that.
Yeah.
I remember seeing like a Point Break, and they were showing, you can surf here, and
yeah, it's great. I mean, just that kind of life. I mean, I was in my 20s, and I worked after I got my master's. I worked for the regulatory agency that managed the coastline, right? And so I was trying to figure out policies about how to clean up pollution, how to manage the explosion in moorings, unregulated moorings all over the coastline, public access, of course. And I had like my four best buddies worked at the same agency, and the backs of our pickup trucks were full of windsurfers and dive gear. And we always used to laugh. We said there was a wind clause in our contract. So if it blew more than 20 knots, man, out the door we went. So so that was, and that just kind of reinforces that love. So I started as a biologist, got into policy, found out that I was much better at policy and writing than I was at being a scientist, a hardcore scientists. And I saw more earlier. Then I was living this great life. Right? I was living on the ocean. A couple of buddies of mine and I worked our way into this property that was going to be developed at some point, but it just kind of stretched out. And then I met my wife, who's a Jersey girl, and she said, "Okay, well, I'm an Italian Jersey girl. If you want to get married, guess what? You have to move into Jersey," which was a good compromise, a good deal for me. So, so I came to New Jersey in the early '90s, and it's been really interesting. I mean, it's got the coast, obviously, the shore is a wonderful, wonderful place with just amazing wildlife. It's at the crossroads of all sorts of ecological and biological pathways that people and animals cross over, and it's got a great culture, right? I like to say when I give talks out in the public that everybody has a Jersey Shore story. Doesn't matter whether you're from Sussex County, or Monmouth, everybody's got a story. So that's how I kind of got here. The guy that ran the American Littoral Society before me had been the executive director for 38 years. He started in the late 60s. And it was a fishing buddy of mine. And he got to be in his later years, decided he needed to step down. And he called me up and said, "You need to come down and do this." So
Wow.
22 years ago. That's how I got
So 22 years?
22 years,
Wow.
yeah.
What is, just as someone who's never heard the term, doesn't know anything about it, what is the American Littoral Society?
It's a non-governmental organization, right? It's nonprofit. It's we call ourselves a coastal conservation organization because all our work is about conserving and restoring a lot lately the natural resources and wildlife along the Jersey Shore. Now, we actually work from New York down to the Delaware Bay, but we run education programs where we talk to school kids and take them out. We have a sort of our fundamental principle about education is that we want to get people to get their feet wet and their hands sandy, right? We take them out to the coastline. We rebuild oyster reefs, we rebuild salt marshes. A lot of the Osprey platforms that you see along the coastline were put up by us in the 80s to try to restore the Osprey populations.
Did you park in the front or the back here?
Parked right out in the front.
All right. In the back, you'll see an Osprey platform that I had installed.
Excellent.
But the thing is, it's a little too low. That needs to be above the tree line and a bit closer to water. So we haven't had any visitors.
Okay.
We also have
years.
a radio tower 2 blocks from here that's very high. That's got a huge Osprey nest.
Got an estimate, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the higher the better, right?
Yeah.
And they don't care what it is. Well, that's great because there's not to go down a rabbit hole, so to speak, but there's a great success story, right? Ospreys and
Definitely.
Yeah,
eagles
big time.
almost died out because of DDT. And the Littoral Society was one of those groups in the late 60s, early 70s that fought to get it banned.
So
And-
DDT was a pesticide or herbicide?
It's a pesticide.
and it would
Pesticide.
weaken the eggs, so when they would sit on the eggs, they'd break.
Exactly. It would run off the fields it was applied on. And, actually it was used in a lot of different ways. You guys are too young, but they used to have these things called Smoky Joes, which were pickup trucks.
Was that
had
where
a
the kids would
fogger.
run behind it
Yeah.
and see who could
I'm
last
one of those
the
kids.
longest? Will you ever hear those stories? No.
So they would fog for mosquitoes. That was and they drive through the neighborhoods. Now the fog was full of DDT, and the kids, myself included, used to ride our bikes behind it because it had this really funky smell to it.
Yeah.
And you had to hold your breath, and as Mark was saying, it's like who can last the longest. But my wife points to that sometimes. It says that explains my
You
behavior.
lasted longer than most.
Right, exactly. But
It's just before we get off at the bald eagle thing, because you're absolutely right. Like nowadays, in my neighborhood, even there's a little cell tower. It's got a bald eagle in it, and it's really cool. But I remember when I was much younger, I used to cut lawns, and I cut one of my best friend's grandma's lawn. Easiest $70 I ever made cutting a lawn, and they had a big bald eagle's nest on their property. They're right on the Massaquan River. And it was like big news. Like people would come out and photograph it. There was a huge preservation thing.
Yep.
I had to be extra careful when I was going around the tree where they were. And now it's almost commonplace. Like I go kayaking and in Belmar, and you see them flying overhead, which is awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool to see them every.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen them in downtown Red Bank. I've seen them, all over the place. But they're not. I mean, it's a success story because a lot of people put a lot of time and energy into getting laws passed to reflect the science. Right. Once the scientists knew that the reason that the eagle populations were dying in the
With
Osprey
chemicals.
was because of this chemical, and they made the connection. Chemical, the DDT flowed off the land, got taken up by fish. Right. The osprey and the eagles would eat the fish. It would pass through their bodies into the eggs, and as you said, made the eggs soft. So when they sat on them, they would crush them. And it's a huge success story because once we banned it, of course, the birds came back. And
What kind of science is that discovers that? Like, is that like specifically as to that story? Is that because people want to know, like, does science matter? Does funding science matter? Is it just some random scientist that decided to study it, or was that funded to determine where the DDT is coming? Is it like an EPA thing, or what?
That's a really great question because it was being done before EPA was created. Right?
Because we're seeing the same stuff today with
Yes.
is global warming, is it BS or not? Are the windmills killing the whales or not? My answer to all that would be is what does the science say? Right. And then being a plaintiff's attorney, Mark and I as plaintiff's attorneys, we understand that corporations and special interests can try to create their own science and hire scientists or doctors to skew the research and to have outcome determinative studies that get to the outcome they want. So if you can talk a little bit about that in terms of maybe not necessarily DDT, but I mean, certainly that worked, but what's the genesis of that science? Who's paying for it? And then how does that relate to today in terms of global warming and whether or not the windmills are killing the whales? Like, where is that science and how can people trust that science based at least on your experience with the Littoral Society in your career?
Okay, that's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot.
Cool, but
it's a lot to unpack.
We got the next hour now.
Okay, excellent. Well, because it's really timely. And you're absolutely right. There's a thing there's a sort of a joke, but it's cruel in a way that science doesn't care whether you believe it or not. Right? It's happening. The world functions in a certain way, and we are clearly altering it to our own demise through all sorts of different things. So in the case of DDT, which is a good example, wildlife biologists who were usually associated with universities, right, and maybe some private groups like the National Audubon Society. Back in those days, there weren't as many nonprofits as there are today, but the shorebird or the wildlife biologists start to see dips in populations, right? Because they're always watching it as they're trying to learn about these animals. Then they start to figure out, well, why is that happening, right? So they'll go and they'll want to test the nest, right? And they'll find these crushed eggs. So one thing leads to another, and you start to think, well, why are the eggs softer than they should be, right? Well, something about the egg formation is changing.
Like when you talk about Doge and they come up with these examples, and I've heard this in the news before Doge, like if one of the political parties wants to attack funding or something, they say, and can you believe this? They paid $3 million to determine, like the crustacean egg. Those stories. They're like, can you believe our government paid, $8 million to study the genesis of, I don't know, shrimp in something? Like, you ever hear those
Oh yeah,
stories?
all the time, and more so
Which
now.
any one of could be the next cure to cancer, the next
Right.
whatever.
I could see in the 70s or 80s saying, can you believe this? The government's paid $8 million to study goose eggs or to study eagle eggs.
Right.
You know what I mean? And
Right.
meanwhile, it saved the bald eagle doing those studies. So are those studies as dumb as they're sometimes made out to be? Like, I don't know.
No, they're usually mischaracterized, taken out of
Big time.
context. I mean, look, the anti-environmental movement, the oil industry, the chemical industries, the land developers, they simply lie. and they know it, and they've done their own. You hear about how about climate change, right? ExxonMobil had done its own studies and knew that the burning of fossil fuels was going to alter the atmosphere, the climate, and to the detriment, and they just buried that, right? You hear the stories about, the cases like Tom's River, or there was one up in Massachusetts.
The Tom's River Ciba-Geigy.
Ciba-Geigy
Yeah, I worked
case.
on that case for
Yeah,
for the homeowners and the cancer clusters down there.
Right, and
It was mostly benzines. They were dumping the Ciba-Geigy. The reason Ciba-Geigy moved there is because it's the largest aquifer, so they could dump the chemicals and it easily goes down into the soil. Because
Right.
It's sandy soil.
right.
Those are legacy historic things, and they had the drum disposal area that was 50,000 drums of chemicals in open containers, drums with terrible benzenes. It was all dye stuff it was a dye manufacturer factory there, and it was in an there was no
Unlined.
liner,
Right.
so it was just leaching in, and it wasn't by accident. They did it because that's what they were doing with their garbage. They were just leaching it into our aquifer.
Right. So it's hard to say that they weren't aware of the harm that was going to cause, right? And they just, because there were no laws in place, or very few laws, or weaker laws, or lack of enforcement of those laws.
There was no statutory laws necessarily, but there's always the common law,
Right.
which is kind of what we do. Like we'll bring a lawsuit under negligence or nuisance. When we brought the Ciba-Geigy case many years ago, we were alleging nuisance and taking because they were essentially housing chemicals on the neighbors' properties by just housing the chemicals in the soil there. But anyway,
Because of the connection.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, your question about the science
Yeah.
and the critics of the science, that is all. In my opinion, that's all propaganda. Right?
Yeah,
It is
motivated by profit. And
motivated by
money and-
profit and speaking to an uneducated populace, and a populace which is gotten worse, dumber and dumber in terms of our understanding of science, right? And
How do you combat that? Because it feels like almost more the more you advocate and the more you say this is wrong, look at the science, the more people dig in and fight against it.
well, I think if you
Wait a second.
okay,
Yeah.
So we do this podcast.
Oh, there you go.
We do this podcast in our library, and our library is a lot smaller now because everything's online. But this book came to mind. It's a book written by David Michaels called "Doubt Is Their Product: How Industry's Assault on Science Threatens Your Health."
Right.
But anyway, timely here, Max.
Right, and that's all really well documented, right? That whole propaganda campaign to discredit science, and now the Trump administration and Doge have taken it to the next level. Now they're discrediting the institutions as well as the science, without any basis, without a real public debate where they say, "Well, here's our findings.
Yeah.
You look at the findings, and if we agree, then we'll take this course of action." They're just, one bearing, trying to keep it out from places that can be debated or challenged, going after the people who are the sort of the fact checkers, the oversight functions in government, universities, libraries. They're all targeted.
News outlets that
News
report the
outlets, that's right. And the
information.
news outlets
Yeah.
close the media down, right? So that's all control of information. And then unfortunately, if you live in an echo chamber like Fox News, you hear the same propaganda time and time again until people come to believe it without any alternative set of facts, right? So my organization, on a very, very small scale, tries to educate people about things that are going along our coastline and what we can do and what the problems are. But there is absolutely a national push that's going to make people more vulnerable. It's going to make people sicker. That's going to put them in harm's way. They were just talking last week about doing away with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, right? So, and then 2 days later, Kentucky and Tennessee flood.
Yeah.
All right. And so, what's embodied, I don't even call it their morality, but their way of thinking is, well, screw them. Let those people in Tennessee fend for themselves.
That probably voted for.
That's the irony of it, of course, is that, all the analysis that I've seen, they think that the impacts of these cutbacks of public safety laws and environmental laws ensuring the quality of vaccines and pharmaceuticals, it's all going to fall disproportionately on red states, right? Because they tend to be lower in income, and have all sorts of other factors working against them. And that's like adding insult to injury in my way. But the science is fundamental, right? The science still goes on, and even though they're trying to make it as difficult as possible, and think about the colleges, the universities they targeted have all been the big Ivies, right? So far, which I think is just probably a personal thing going on. But it should be very scary because you think about the impact of climate change on the ocean. Climate change is the number one threat to the integrity and the condition and the health of the ocean right now. It's changing the chemistry, right? Carbon going into the waters and making it more acid. Ecosystems function on very specific
Temperature.
qualities, right?
Yeah.
Temperature, turbidity, the acidity or the lack of acidity. So we're seeing that, and we're seeing that influencing as the temperatures increase. We're seeing animals that live off the Jersey Shore move north, right? We're seeing ones from the south come up. It's great fishing on black sea bass, but they weren't here like they were, 25 years ago. So our ability to manage that stuff wisely, so we still get the benefits from it. Right? Think about everything on the Jersey Shore that's built around the fishing industry. Yeah. If you destroy the ocean, you destroy the estuaries and the estuaries' ability to produce fish, then all those jobs and all that recreation and all that enjoyment of taking your kids striper fishing for the first time is all going to be lost.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
just as a quick aside, if people that aren't familiar with the area that we live in, the Asbury Park Press is one of like the main local papers. There's an entire section in the summer that's like hook, line, and sinker,
Yeah,
which is
hook, line,
just
and sinker.
devoted
Exactly.
to fishing.
Exactly.
So it is a huge part of the community here.
But the dismantling of science, dismantling of the environmental laws that protected us, is really an attempt to tear down those institutions so they can't protect us. Because the protection, and you guys know this as plaintiffs, ends up being limitations on polluters, limitations on developers going into public lands, wanting to take our national parks to build housing in, being able to discharge untreated toxins into our waterways. I mean, that's what those laws do. They force those businesses to account for the pollution that they're creating. And without them, without the laws, and without a federal linkage, a federal presence to enforce them, then we go back to, what we looked like in the 1930s.
As we were sitting here, and you threw the dates out. I think you said 1961 when the Littoral Society was formed.
Yep.
I was like, man, that's not that long ago. And then I started thinking about, when the EPA first came into effect, when OSHA was passed, and I'm like, we don't have a crazy long history of regulating these types of things.
Right. Right.
As we clearly need, and as time goes on, and we become more and more developed, it seems even more important. Because as plaintiffs, it's always, we feel like we're going up against, some major entity, be it a giant insurance company or what. And it seems like it's the same thing here, kind of on your side. You're saying, hey, this is bad for the environment, and this is why. And then you have some multi-billion-dollar corporation that's like, oh, it might not be. And we paid this guy to say why it might not be. And then you have a dispute over these facts that, you need regulations for, you need
Right. And you want to be able to point to some third-party objective scientist to say, this is what the facts are, right? And, the sort of the ray of hope in that bleak situation you just described is that we beat those guys occasionally, right?
Yeah.
You guys beat them occasionally.
Yep.
Maybe you beat them more than I do, but, we've taken on Scott's Fertilizer, we've taken on ExxonMobil, over the years. And when you get into the court, which can act as a fair arbiter of what the damages are, whose rights have been compromised, the science becomes very influential and very important. And you're the lawyers, you know better than I do the impact of precedent, right? And so it not only affects that one case, but it sets the sets the bar, so to speak, for everybody else. And that's why I think they're so determined to tear that stuff down, right? In that it's never a fair balance, right? Because they do have billions of dollars, and people, get their information in a different way, and they seem to accept, unverified nonsense as easily as they do good information sometimes, which is an education problem.
Yeah. It seems like, and Jerry, you talk about it more and more these days. It's like, what is more, like, what's right, what's wrong, like, what's morality, and what is, a bottom line. And it seems almost like a no-brainer that protecting oceans, protecting bays, tidal flowing waters, the environment, and the people that live in the environment should be a no-brainer. But it seems like you get science discredited. You get, a lot of these things that you wouldn't think in our day and age could be discredited. So I'm sure it's an uphill battle a lot of the time when it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always an uphill battle because it is one, the status quo is a consumptive, non-sustainable world, right? We are slowly wearing this planet down, and maybe not so slowly nowadays, but having the ability to bring science to bear, through the law and through the courts has been critical to securing environmental benefits. And there's a lot of talk now about the lunatic lefty environmentalists that are driving all this stuff. Well, ask yourself, ask your wife or your partner, do you want your kids to drink clean water, or it doesn't really matter to you that they have chemicals in them which could give them cancer or lead to autism, right? Do you want them to be safeguarded against measles or not? So those laws protect people's interests, which are, diffuse. They're not as concentrated as a corporation. You can point to a corporation and say, here's what that corporation wants to do. But the public rights, and our interests are much more diverse. And that's what those laws, to me, are meant to protect. It's not, I love horseshoe crabs. We do a lot of work with these crazy creatures that,
so prehistoric. They blow my mind that they're
450 million years old.
Wow.
But that's a great story. So there's an animal who was unregulated, and in the early 90s, the Asian seafood markets for whelk and eel really exploded. So, the demand rises, the market responds, right? Guys went down and they fished out almost 75% of the horseshoe crabs.
I didn't know you could eat horseshoe crabs.
Well, you don't eat them. What they do is they cut the horseshoe crab into pieces, stuff it in a trap, and then the trap attracts the whelk and the eels. So it's a bait. It's only for a bait, right? But little do people know that the blood of a horseshoe crab is used to produce a substance called LAL, which is limulus amoebocyte lysate, which it has the qualities, because it's copper-based as opposed to iron-based, like our blood, that it clots when it's exposed to certain endotoxins. And so they use it to test medical instruments. Like if they're going to put something in your body, you don't want it to be contaminated with toxins that can kill you, bacteria that can kill you. So they use this substance derived from horseshoe crabs to test those things. They test vaccines with it. So, talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? But there's a reason to defend those animals, right? So we worked, and one of the things I'm proudest about is I was able to get a law through the legislature to stop fishing them for bait, right? Still allowing them to be used for biomedical. But it points out that here's, what might be seen as a kind of a lunatic lefty cause is to protect these prehistoric looking animals until you peel it back and you say, here's this huge benefit to humanity. Many of the pharmaceutical drugs are derived from natural products, right? From the rainforest in particular. More and more derived from the ocean. They're finding.
So when you advocated to, let's call it save the horseshoe crab, it sounds like you took something of a middle road approach. You weren't like, oh, we got to ban this. You said just for bait, but permitted for pharmaceuticals. It sounds like you took like a reasonable.
Right. Well, we weren't going to put public health at risk, right? And it wasn't we didn't think at the time, at least, that it was necessary. We thought if we cut the bait harvest out, then the animals would survive. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be true because the demand, when we went through the pandemic and there was lots of testing going on of vaccines, the demand for horseshoe crabs rose.
Wow.
So we continue to have this fight about, what's a healthy population look like.
Where's their territory? I mean, I know they're at the Jersey Shore and everything. I do this row in Cape May in the summers. It's a 15-mile row around Cape May, and it's
Littered.
No, I'm not going to say littered. That's a bad word to say.
Right.
But there is a very robust population of
Yeah.
valuable horseshoe crabs down there. So where is their
So-
territory?
So actually, when I talked about earlier about New Jersey being such a special place ecologically, the Delaware Bay is the epicenter of the Atlantic horseshoe crab population, right? There are 4 different species spread out around the world. The ones that are in our hemisphere, the biggest concentration of them is in the Delaware Bay. So you see them all up and down the coast, but not like you do in the bay there. So
You said they're 450 million years old.
450
They've been around
million
for
years old.
450 million. How long do they live, some of the horseshoe crabs?
they can live to be 20, 30 years old if
Wow.
they're not. You see the really big ones with lots
Yeah.
of slipper shells on them and
Yeah.
barnacles. Yeah, they can be old.
When we grew up at the Jersey Shore, that was the most terrifying animal that you would encounter.
You get the
that you're-
tail sticks out.
Yeah, allegedly it would stab you and everything,
Yeah.
but it doesn't stab at all, that tail.
The tail, which is called the telson, is the right term for it, is used that when the crabs come ashore to lay their eggs, they get tossed around the waves, right? End up on their backs. They use that
Flip over.
telson to flip themselves back over. That's what that's for.
Yeah. They're such a they blow my mind, you know?
I think your organization is fascinating. When I called you, I was trying to get you to leave you a voicemail or something, and I went through your voicemail prompts of the Littoral Society, and it was like, for the crabs, press 2. For the
That's
for the oysters, press 3.
Yeah.
For this program, press 4, and it went up to it's fascinating. So, like, what kind of programs, like, talk more about some of the things, the successes that you guys have had over the years, things that you've done. And, if I forget to, I want to thank you for what you do. There's a lot of public service to it and what your organization does. But if you could talk more about how you guys have made life around the Jersey Shore, more fun and more healthy for people and more enriched and fulfilling. Like,
Sure.
what kind of stuff have you guys
And
done?
if I could just piggybacking off that, could you also explain like logistically how it works as well? Like, because you guys you said you're non-government. Do you petition a legislator, Congress, whatever it may be?
All
Kinda
of the
how-
above,
Yeah.
really. It's well, if you love the ocean and you love things that are in it and love being on the beach, it's a great place to be. And so when I started there, it was a much smaller organization, but had been really influential because the guy that preceded me, Derry Bennett, was just a force of nature in and of himself. And a lot of the old timers will remember him. But we do our work through education, conservation, and advocacy. Those are our 3 main program. We call them program areas. It's a charitable organization, so all the money is donated to us. Right? We either there are members and there are memberships available. I always joke it costs you probably less than it would cost you for 2 lattes in Red Bank to join the Littoral Society. But then we seek government grants, right? So the Fish and Wildlife Service U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been a great partner, and they work with us because, one, we're more efficient than government is often, right? I mean, I'm in essence running a small business. It has about a $5 million a year budget, and I have 23 staff, and they're spread out New York, Sandy Hook, and down in Millville in Cumberland County.
Are there different chapters in other parts of the country?
Yeah, there have been over the years. We used to sue the government a lot about Clean Water Act violations, and mainly because when the Clean Water Act was first coming into effect, people wanted to ignore it, and they weren't sure that EPA was going to enforce the laws, and sometimes it didn't. So we took them to court. There's a citizen's right suit in the Clean Water Act. We would use the money when we won, which was a lot. If there were supplemental environmental projects required or something, we would create a chapter. So we had them in Cape Cod at one point. We had them in Puget Sound, and they would do their work for as long as they could. And it was a very grassrootsy kind of thing, and they would run out of money, and we would just close it down. So, but when I came on, 20 something years ago, I tried to restructure it a bit to get more philanthropy. So, big foundations like the William Penn Foundation in Philadelphia, the Monarch Foundation in New York, to give us larger chunks of money to support this programming. And we would come to them, with the ideas of what are we going to do. So in the education world, the first sort of way we did that was you just took people on walks, right? And again, my predecessor was an amazing naturalist, and he was a great storyteller, and he was this long, tall guy, never wore shoes, right? And he would take people out to the beach, and we would drag a seine net, right, which is a net between two poles, and you come up with all this amazing life that nobody knew was there. When you look out at the water, you don't see all the fish and the crabs, and people just went nuts, where you get a chance to play with the fish and be told what it's all about, right? So then we scaled that up into school programs. I wanted to get it into the schools, and we started with schools that were in what they used to call Abbott districts or underserved communities, right? So we worked in Asbury, Keyport, Atlantic City, places where kids lived blocks from the ocean, but had never been down to the beach or had no idea about what the life was. It was, just on their doorstep. So we created this program that I called Sequest, right, which sort of harkens back to Lloyd Bridges, and again, having grown up in the '60s, watching these things, and so we brought marine science curriculum into these classrooms that the schools didn't have it because they couldn't afford to provide it, and then we would take the kids out. We'd take the kids to the beach, and we'd take them to the back bays off Atlantic City. And we had a program at one point. We were making fish condos. We took laundry baskets with all the holes in them, sealed them off on the open side, and dropped them in the water. You come back a week later, all sorts of things have grown on them. It's full of things that have made their way into it. And you teach the kids, about what's going on with the structure of estuary, ecologies are. And then we started after, a little bit before, we started trying to restore oysters into Raritan Bay in particular, right? Because the Hudson Raritan Estuary was once the oyster capital of the world. New York's oysters would be thrown into boxcars of trains and shipped to the West Coast. And
They called it Oyster Bay, right? There wasn't there like Oyster Bay.
There was
Long
Oyster Bay out
Island?
on Long Island. There's a great book, Mark Kurlansky.
He wrote Salt, Salmon.
Right.
Yeah, all this.
He's got one called The Big Oyster.
Okay.
And it's about New York Harbor and about the oysters that were there.
Just as a quick aside to him, he takes a very specific topic. Like he's got a book called Salt, one called Salmon,
Cod.
Yeah, cod. And
Yep.
he writes a 200 to 300 page book just about that one commodity and the influence it's had on the world. And he does a really good job with it.
Yeah, he's really great. But he sort of shares with people that when Henry Hudson sailed into the Hudson Bay or the Hudson River, he had to stop and send out small boats because the oyster reefs were so big that they stuck up out of the water and they were navigation hazards, right? All gone now because of mismanagement and pollution. And
Like there's no oysters in the
very-
tri-state
very
area other
little.
than what you guys have replenished?
Yeah, very little. So our partner actually was a group that was a part of us for a long time until they got to be so good at what they were doing. We spun them off, and they went off to do their own thing called the New York, New Jersey Baykeeper.
Baykeepers,
Yeah, really great people, and just amazing crusaders for right about doing right by the estuaries. And and an estuary that's viewed like the Meadowlands and the Hackensack River as places that are damaged and destroyed and not worth anything. So, anyways, the education programs, then we started to talk about that stuff, right? And we did a program a couple of years ago. We started called Operation Oyster, where we recruited all the dock owners on the Navesink and Shrewsbury River to hang test plates off. We were trying to figure out whether there were any oysters left in the river system, because Oyster Point, right, in Red Bank at the top of the river, there was, before there was a hotel, there was a big oyster bed there. Wow.
And like, is that gone, you think, just from over harvesting or from pollution or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both, yeah.
What kills oysters other than a shucker?
Yeah. Nickel, copper, chromium. One of the big problems was copper on the bottoms of boats, right?
Okay.
Anti-fouling paint was copper-based, and the reason nothing grew on it was because copper is toxic to marine organisms. But I think one of the really big problems that we tried to address was oysters need other oyster shells to grow on usually, right? In a healthy reef, they'll spawn, put it out into the water, and the spat, they call it, will settle onto the other oysters, and then they grow from that. But when we started harvesting them, we would just take the oysters and we would throw them in the parking lots, mix them up as lime and concrete to build the foundations of houses. So all that physical structure that the oysters needed didn't go back into the water. So that, in addition to the pollution we were pouring on top of them, really led to the demise.
And when was, like, what time period was that?
This is, starting in the mid 1800s, really. I mean, we harvested them forever.
Because right down the road, not down the road, but Alair State Park in Wall Township, the whole foundation of many of the buildings are oyster shells.
Oyster shell.
Yeah. Like, I'll go mountain biking back in that way, and I'll find shells and things because it's all back there.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I went to college in Southern Maryland, and all the roads, other than the main state highway, are made out of oyster shell.
Yeah.
So, but the education stuff that was
So if you do shuck one, it's better to throw the shell back to where they can use the dead shells?
Well, so here's how we did that. We tried to approach it. We have a program we call Shuck It, Don't Chuck It.
Okay.
And if you look during the summertime, you might see a big yellow Dodge pickup truck with oysters on the side of it, and Shuck It, Don't Chuck It. So we have a
So
bunch
that was one of the voicemails. That's
Yes.
the one that stuck. It said for the Shuck It, Don't Chuck It,
that's
press
great.
10 or something.
Right.
Okay.
So we
Now I
partner with
understand.
restaurants, right? Restaurants in Asbury, up in Monmouth Beach. There's a couple in Highlands, I think, and they keep their shell. So when they sell all the oysters to their customers, we provide them with buckets, and they dump it in there. We come and collect it.
Okay.
And then we have a big pile at the tip of Sandy Hook where we cure the shell for a year, and then we put it back into restoration projects. We use it to build reefs.
Wow.
So if you look at our Facebook page, just recently we were down on the Delaware Bay. We had all this oyster shell that we had recycled, in essence. Right?
Why do you cure it for a year? What does that mean? Just
Just to
bleach
make,
it or
it just
something?
means to make sure that anything that might be living on it, like in particular bacteria,
Okay, so you're not spreading.
you're not
that
spreading
stuff.
it, right? Exactly. You want to make sure that the shell doesn't have any organics on it. The easiest way to do this is just to leave it out in a pile and
And let the sun bleach
and let the
it.
sun
Cure
and the seagulls
Wow.
do their thing, right? And come back and get it. And
Things our ancestors probably knew to do centuries and centuries ago.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean,
And when I say
ju-
ancestors, I mean, like, we're talking about like the Lenape Indians. And
well, so just
The ones Keto owes his bar back to.
yeah, right, exactly. There's I think I mentioned that my family has a farm down the Chesapeake.
yeah.
And they did a historical survey of the property. The farm was founded in 1692, and they found what they call a shell midden, which is such a big pile of oyster shells where the Lenape would camp for the summer, and when they would finish the oyster, they'd toss it into this communal pile. So, and these things are big.
Wow.
So yeah, they just and then I don't know whether they use the shell for other things they might have.
That's since we're throwing out books. This guy Jack Weatherford wrote a book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Loved it, found it so fascinating. How Genghis Khan was one of the first guys for like religious freedom, uniting all these different communities. And I'm reading one by him now, Native American, or I think it's called Native Americans in the Making of the Modern World, and how there's so many things that spread out from what they did. Recommend that to anyone that's listening, and because it deals a lot of like what we're talking about now. Like knowing more than we know about how to use certain tree barks and how to sustainably like farm and fish and do all that stuff.
Right. Well, so the anthropologist in me, when I found that arrowhead, I'm sitting there, I'm holding something that somebody made thousands of years ago. Right?
Crazy.
And his or her, probably his culture had been there for thousands of years before that. Right. So that whole debate about, we live in an industrialized world. It's not sustainable. And you can look to other cultures, even the Han Dynasty in China, were much more sustainable in their ability to live on the planet.
The guys on Easter Island, not so much.
Yeah, right. Well, sometimes everyone makes a mistake, right?
Yeah.
So,
like consuming your natural resources to build statues. And,
right, exactly. But, we try to make those connections, right? And as you can tell from the conversation, right, the more you just drill down into it, there's all this cool stuff to learn from. So our work starts with education, and we lead a hike on New Year's Day to the tip of Sandy Hook from our office, which is out in Fort Hancock. It's about a 3.5 mile walk, and we go all the way out to the tip of Sandy Hook, and my staff and I, we'll talk to all the people that come along, and we'll pick up horseshoe crabs, shells, or pieces of this, pieces of that, talk about what we're seeing. In recent years, it's been very cool because we've seen dolphins and whales and, stuff right off the beach, which people just are unaware is there, are there. So, that whole education program, I've tried to, one, make it available to people that don't have it available to them otherwise. Because I'm a big believer in equity. And then we've tried to just introduce people to the magic of the coastline, right?
Let me ask you a question. Equity in result or equity in opportunity?
Yeah, well, from our perspective, from what we do is equity and opportunity. Right?
Yeah, okay.
You can't.
I guess, did we said this, but.
I don't want to keep talking like personal anecdotes and about myself, but as you're talking about the education thing, I remember being in either like middle school, early high school, and I went to Wall Township, just right down the road, and we took a trip to Sandy Hook as part of like biology class or something, and we went, and I think we went for clams, or we did some big net, and would that be for clams or
Fish.
Okay,
Seining for fish, something
like that, and it was such a cool. Everyone was so pumped about it to be there. It was such a great experience, and like you talk about education and outreach, and that affected me, although I don't remember, I guess, what we were going for with the net. But between that and doing like junior lifeguards as a, 10, 11, 12-year-old kid,
right,
it just set me on a course for, caring about all this stuff.
That's great. Well, so, equity and opportunity that, results. So that's what we want, is that people, not everybody's going to become a marine biologist, but, we think that there's value, one, in everybody having access to a resource, the ocean, the coast, which belongs to them. Public trust doctrine, right? That is a jus publicum, right? That's public lands, and people.
Which that's a hot button issue too. Even we've spoke about that a whole episode.
We could do a series on this because Mark and I have both lived this.
Yeah.
But we have no format here. It's kind of like stream of consciousness, and I know we're trying to keep a format. We're going from education, the successes that you've done, but every time you bring something up, it pops things in my mind that I'm just really curious about asking about. So let's step back. So the Littoral Society's office is at Sandy Hook,
right?
And Sandy Hook back in the day, because it is at the mouth of a strategic international harbor, was also a military strategic point. And on Highlands, Harshaw Woods Park was an old Nike naval base, and they still have these bunkers that point out to Long Island, and those initial guns could go 20 miles. So what's going on with Sandy Hook? First of all, again, this is like stream of consciousness, so I apologize to our audience. Like it's a little schizophrenic, a little scatterbrained here. But first of all, when I was growing up, like seals were something that was like in the Arctic, like nowhere around here. Now I've seen seals in Monmouth County. There's seal populations off Sandy Hook. So, I think the Littoral Society has so many great success stories, but what's up with all these seals? Is this a new thing, or we're just noticing them now?
You see signs now when you walk onto the beach. It's like, if you see a seal, don't approach it, which
yeah.
is definitely never something I saw even in my lifetime.
Well,
As a surfer, it makes me a little nervous because I know it feeds on seals, but
yeah,
go
right,
ahead,
exactly.
Well,
that's I'm a scuba diver, and I used to dive in New England, and there were great whites in New England. They're here as well, but that's another set of stories.
But is this seal population a
So
new
seal
thing?
population, yes. So there's, it
Or
ties
is it a
into the
bad
general-
sign because of global warming and they're
No,
moving?
no. The crabs. The seals are here because there are more seals, right? Because there's a law, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which said you can't harass them, you can't harm them, you can't hunt them. And once we stopped doing that, the population started to recover. Now we also put limits on what's called the reduction fishery. Fishermen mostly out of Virginia, they will come and catch the bunker, right? And they take it back and they reduce it down and then use the oil in cosmetics, in dog food, and fertilizers. And
Really, a bunker?
yeah, from Bunker Menhaden. I get mixed up on my regional colloquialisms. Right? We used to call me alewife in the Chesapeake.
Well, be careful because Max here is fact checking everything we say. Max,
He's taking notes on every detail.
Yeah, just let me retire before you write your book, okay?
Max is he's a senior at Communications High School, and he's sitting in today on the podcast. He's helping us out at the law firm this his senior year.
Excellent. Please produce more good environmental lawyers. So when we stop boiling the fish down for fertilizer and for fish oil pills, right? They remained available as bait or in food for seals and whales. And if there's a food source there, there's the old maxim that nature abhors a vacuum, right? And animals will move into places that have habitat and have food available to them, which is another reason why you're seeing the whales in closer to shore now. The humpbacks, which are the primary species that people see, are increasing. They're not increasing astronomically. They didn't have a big jump 15 years ago when we first started seeing them come back again. It's because the fish are available. So the seals are there's more seals, and as the young seals get towards maturity, mom and dad push them away, right? And so they expand out into available habitat. And because we've restored the water quality and lowered the number of fish being caught, the seals can move into that territory. They probably were, here's a really unscientific statement, but millions more before we started harvesting them, right? Before we started slaughtering them. And that's really what it was. So nature bounces back, right? Now we run seal tours. We do with the Sea Streak Ferry operation that runs into Manhattan. They dedicate a couple of their boats during seal season, and we go out. We put our educators on the boat with them, and we talk about the seals. We talk about the seabirds you see, the gannets, the ones that dive into the water. If you've ever seen them, never noticed them, big white birds. There's an amazing amount of life, even in New Jersey, right, as urban as it is, because of those things we were talking about earlier, that if you know where to look for it, right? If you've ever been on a wildlife tour with a really good guide, they can point to things. You're like, how did you see that, right? How did you see that?
We even have, and I was saying, again, not to keep jumping in, there's a spot called, it's just a wildlife preserve, we called it, where down the street from where I grew up, it's just this paved path, drive down it for like a minute or two, and then there's a spot to launch kayaks. Then we called it the Narrows. You're back amongst like all the reeds and things in the Massaquan River. And it is like my friends and I would go back there and be like, how are more people not here? Like, how do we have all these neighbors that don't even know this place exists?
Yeah.
Like it really is. It's wild.
So, so that's the seals. I think you're right. I think the sharks will be not far behind them. There's some evidence that the New York Bight, right, that sort of crescent-shaped part of the water between the tip of Long Island and here, used to be either a pupping ground or a birthplace for great whites. So, the downside will be for surfers in particular and divers, there probably will be an increase in the great white populations, but they're very slow to grow and come to maturity. So,
Do you think the New York Harbor and the Hudson River will come back full? I mean, do you think we'll ever see maybe dolphins in there more again?
Oh yeah, we see it now.
Yeah.
There was a whale in the East River a couple weeks ago.
Wow.
Seals, if you go up to Swinburne Island, right, which is just below the Tappan Zee, below the Verrazano, it used to be where they put the immigrants that had contagious diseases when they came in through Ellis Island, full of seals. That's 8 or 9 miles up the river. I think it's possible to restore the estuary. Whether or not we'll ever get back to the functionality, the abundance that it produced before we started mucking around with it, I don't know, because there's still, all the PCBs that GE dumped into the Hudson River. There's still all the dioxin that Diamond Shamrock dumped into the Passaic River. There's, just years of discharges into the Arthur Kill, a lot of which are perpetual and persistent chemicals. Well, they'll have some impact on the estuary forever, but even you think about the gains of what we've seen in our own lifetime, right? Because of the Clean Water Act in particular. My wife tells a story about, her family had a little can of kerosene at the back door because when they came off the beach, they had tar and oil on the bottom of their feet.
And they had to get it off.
They had to get it off, right? You don't see that very, very rarely. Now it's an illegal, a ship going by occasionally that will discharge it illegally. So I think, the stories, the proof is there that these places can come back to life and bring all these benefits to us, right? Whether it's the joy of kind of finding a place that nobody else knows about and exploring, or seeing dolphins or seeing whales offshore. All that's a benefit, and there's economics that are attached to that, right? There's lots of, we're talking about the recreational fishing industry. I always say not always say, but occasionally I will say to my friends in the recreational fishing community, they're always fighting about catch limits and allocations. And that's because the number of fish, they're back up from where they were down, but now they're shrinking again. It's like, well, we should really be focused on producing more fish. Let's clean up the estuaries, rebuild the salt marshes, rebuild the oyster reefs, which we know how to do, right? And that's the other parts of the programming work that we do. We do these restoration projects to show it can be done. And that'll bring all these other benefits back to us, which I think are benefits that are important to people.
Has there been with the Littoral Society and maybe some of your affiliates, has there been anything with respect to opening up the old estuaries in New Jersey? So if you look at a historic map of New Jersey, all those lakes you see, like Silver Lake and Fletcher Lake, and they're
Bradley,
the one in Bradley, Sylvan Lake, and Wreck Pond.
Yep.
They're all natural estuaries to the ocean, and for some reason, I don't know if it was the Army Corps of Engineers, they've all been dammed up. Maybe there's been a pipe put in, but I feel like if those would be open to back up, you would have a natural estuary again. You'd also have a great surfing break because it would, it would form great like sandbars there for surfing, and also like in Deal Lake, which is between Lock Harbor and Asbury. We're in a rowing group. It's called the Jersey Shore Rowing Association, which also does some advocacy, but it's a group of first responders and lifeguards that do these ocean surf races and compete at the United States Life Saving Association Nationals in the summer. And we row on those a lot. And one of the big ones that we row on is Deal Lake. And we couldn't row this past weekend and for the foreseeable future because apparently 70,000 tons of sewage is just got discharged in there. And I don't know how they're going to clean it up, but it seems to me if those estuaries were opened up again into their natural state and maybe put bridges over them for the traffic, that has there been anyone ever talk about that or anything?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, Mark and I were talking that it's at Wreck Pond after Hurricane Sandy.
It opened up as the natural estuary
right,
again.
Exactly.
And I'm like, why are they here with their backhoes doing this thing again?
Well, because everybody wants the beach. They want the beach both for storm protection because the houses are built really close to the ocean. When the hurricanes come in, there's a lot of damage, and the beaches can protect them to a certain extent to do that, right? But when Wreck Pond presented that opportunity, so Wreck Pond historically has been a spawning area for river herring. Yeah.
And they go many miles, probably
way
5,
up to the
10
top
miles
of it.
up.
Yep, exactly. So we worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to build a new
It's a lot
box
bigger.
cult. Yeah, we built that.
That's awesome.
And it's designed in a way so it goes further offshore than the older one, right? It has little ports, they're not ports because they have glass in them, but ways to let light into the tunnel because the herring don't like to travel in the dark.
That follows them. Okay.
Yeah, it follows them up. And then it has controllable floodgates on that's inside of Wreck Pond itself.
Right.
So it has dual functions to it that when you have big rains and floods and lots of runoff coming down from the upper parts of the watershed, Spring Lake can open those gates and let that water out. Where it used to get jammed up in the smaller pipe and just back up, it can only put so much water through a pipe at a certain rate, and it would flood the neighborhoods that are on either side of it. So now with this bigger pipe, you can open it up and control that flooding or reduce the flooding. And we open it up in the springtime when the herring come along, and the herring come back up into their traditional spawning grounds. And then we built a fish ladder, at that Old Mill Pond at the dam there.
Yes, in Old Mill.
Old Mill.
Well, sorry, it's the Old Mill Inn in Wall Township.
Yeah.
And there's a
Yeah. So we built that ladder so that the fish can get up over that dam and up into the upper parts of the watershed.
Oh wow.
So and that's because the fish would come up and they get to the dam. It's the old joke about what did the fish say when he ran into underwater obstruction? Damn. Yeah.
That's funny.
So anyways, but that's the way you restore the estuaries, right? You put back, I mean, it would be really cool if we managed them, as ephemeral estuaries that they want to be, right? Let them have natural openings, but people want to have the beach out in front of them.
And so this is sort of a contemporary compromise.
Yes, yeah. So we tried to figure out, how can we let the fish back in?
And keep the bull sharks out, though, right?
That's
right.
right.
Keep the bull sharks out.
We haven't got one yet, but
the Jaws and all the shark attacks in the Jersey Shore in the early 1900s, I think it was. They're pretty sure that was bull shark.
That's what they say.
Oh, really? Not a great white? They think it was a bull shark?
Yeah, because the bull sharks can go in fresh water and salt water, and they're nasty and aggressive. Let's call them aggressive.
Yeah, no, they're definitely aggressive.
And I think they would spawn in estuaries or something.
Huh. It went up the Navesink, right?
No, Matawan Creek.
Okay.
Yeah, I heard that too. You ever read? So
just
becoming
offshore,
a book club, but close to shore.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, he makes it out to be a great white, but I've heard that also that more likely a bull shark. But
he lifeguards, and I used to lifeguard right down a few beaches north of where that attack happened.
Right. Yeah.
But it's always pretty wild.
I'm sorry. You want?
Oscar, you want to take a break? Yeah. Oh, we're good on. We'll take a quick break.
Cool. Okay.